excited because I'm seeing a lot of familiar names, and I really appreciate you for taking the time to attend today. First and foremost, happy spring equinox. I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe, considering the weather. And we will get started. So today we have a webinar which we will be presenting on winning cannabis revenue for kids and community reinvestment. And we are going to talk specifically about the Sacramento story and what we did as a coalition, as a group, in order to win a ballot measure in November of 2022 that established a Sacramento Children's Fund in our city. So my name is Monica Ruelas Mares. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a community organizer with Youth Forward, and I have the complete honor of serving as the coordinator of the Sac Kids First Coalition, which is a coalition that essentially led the campaign to establish the Children's Fund in the city of Sacramento. And today we have an amazing group of panelists for you today. Again, myself, I represent Youth Forward and Sac Kids First. We also have Catherine Liu from the Lou Edwards Group. We have Dao Vang joining us via Hmong Innovating Politics, or HIP, who is a partner organization of Sac Kids First as well. And then we have Sai Lee joining us via EBAYC Sacramento. And EBAYC is also an organization that is a part of the Sac Kids First Coalition. So these are your presenters for today. Please give them a warm welcome, especially shout them out if you know them. And you'll get to know a little bit more about how they were involved in the campaign, Measure L for Sacramento Children's Fund. So first and foremost, we want to give you an overview of the cannabis revenue in the city of Sacramento. Now, it's important to understand that every local entity, city, county, is going to have different policies around their cannabis revenue and how much they bring in. So a couple important questions that we considered when we were deciding which source of revenue we wanted to target for the Children's Fund was how much money does the city actually collect in cannabis tax? And what is this cannabis tax spent on? So knowing the answers to those questions can really start to develop what a campaign would look like if you are looking to target cannabis revenue. So currently the cannabis business operating tax, or the BOT, that the city of Sacramento collects goes into the city's general fund. Now, it's definitely not news that most cities, including the city of Sacramento, spend a bulk of their general fund on emergency services like police and fire. And so understanding that this cannabis tax gets kind of into the mix of all of that, it's really easy to make the assumption that most of the cannabis tax will go towards things like emergency services. The other thing that we noticed was that in 2022, or prior to the year that we are running our campaign, the city of Sacramento brought in approximately $23 million from cannabis business operating tax. Now, working from there, that's where we decided that we wanted to target the specific tax source, because we believe specifically as a coalition and as Youth Forward that the cannabis tax should be used to reinvest in communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs and that were heavily criminalized during this time, specifically Black, Brown, Southeast Asian communities here in Sacramento. So understanding that cannabis is a revenue source that does have a lot of cannabis is a source that does have a lot of problematic history when it comes to the criminalization of it. And so understanding that and wanting the city to start to intentionally invest some of those resources back into those communities that have been disinvested in. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the argument that we made for cannabis to be used for the Children's Fund was not necessarily new. So if you think about how the tobacco tax is used at the state level as well as at the local levels, tobacco tax is used for early childhood, among other things. And so we know that with substances like tobacco, which are addictive and cause harm to our communities as well as our youth, we know that this revenue source has been used for prevention. And so we see the cannabis tax as something very similar. The approach needs to be public health and prevention. And so when we're using the cannabis tax, specifically in Sacramento, we want the city to consider using it through this health equity and prevention lens. I'm going to pass it over to Sai Lee, who is joining us via EBAYC, so that he can talk a little bit more about the history.
Hello, my name is Sai Lee. I'm the managing director for EBAYC in Sacramento. EBAYC is a 47-year-old nonprofit youth development organization based in Oakland's San Antonio neighborhood. EBAYC serves over 2,500 young people in Oakland who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual. EBAYC co-founded and authored Oakland's 1996 Kids First initiative. This established the Oakland Fund for Children and Youth. This currently funds over $19 million in services for children and youth age 0 to 24 in the city of Oakland. So I will overview the two ballot measures that led up to Measure L, Measure Y in 2016 and Measure G in 2020. Next slide, please. So in 2015, some city council members were thinking about raising taxes to support children and youth. During this time, EBAYC convened high school youth to ensure that youth voices and opinions are taken into account in any tax measures for youth services. Our youth met with adult community leaders, visited the San Francisco Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which was developed in 1992. The Oakland Fund for Children and Youth in 96, and the Rise Youth Center in Richmond. Youth learned how these cities established their public funded children's funds. Our youth developed their own youth community needs assessment survey and got over 1,500 youth to respond to their survey questions. Sacramento City Council placed Measure Y on the June 2016 election ballot. Measure Y was to establish a children's fund by imposing a 5% business operations tax on cannabis businesses. EBAYC Youth, in partnership with Hmong Innovating Politics, actively campaigned for Measure Y. Measure Y needed the support of 2/3 of voters. Unfortunately, Measure Y lost with 65.86% of the vote. So the next iteration of Measure G in 2020, in 2017, EBAYC put a call to action to community organizations to launch the Sacramento Kids First Coalition, better known as Sac Kids First. Sac Kids First met regularly and developed its own ballot measure that would set aside 2.5% of all annual city general fund revenue into a dedicated children's fund. Sac Kids First eventually qualified this ballot measure, known as Measure G, for the March 2020 election after collecting nearly 50,000 signatures. A budget set aside needs 50% or more of the votes. Despite our grassroots efforts, we lost with 45% of voters in support and 55% against, but we demonstrated real power, influence, and through Measure G and Sac Kids First, we compelled the mayor and other city council members to work with us to organize one more ballot measure.
So now we're going to start talking specifically about the Sacramento Children's Fund campaign, otherwise known as Measure L. So an important thing to note is that in 2020, after Measure G lost, we did not quit. Literally, it was March 2020 that the election went on. And then in April, we actually met with the mayor remotely because the stay-at-home orders were now in place. Of course, 2020 was the year that the pandemic and the protocols went into place. And so leading up to the Measure L campaign, 2020 and 2021 were very strategic years for Sac Kids First and all of our partners. We met regularly with the mayor and ally city council members. And in between that time, so between 2020 and 2022, there were 2 new council members that were elected that were actually supportive of us and talked a lot about supporting youth and young people as a part of their campaign. We held district level meetings with council members and children and youth advocates who lived in their districts. So it was really important that although we knew the council members that we were going to work with, because they had already established that they were children's advocates, we knew that it was still important to garner the support or at least be in contact with the other council members on the city council. We also had a Sacramento Kids First Youth Action Committee at the time, which held town halls and meetings with the mayor and council members. On this slide here, you'll see a picture of that specific meeting and the audience of about 350 individuals. And so we had brought the mayor out, and the youth of the Youth Action Committee had planned to ask him very detailed and specific questions about his involvement in our next campaign. Over the course of 6 years, Sac Kids First, we built a stronger and more diverse coalition with new supporters. And it was really important for us to continue that momentum and not just stay silent after the Measure G loss. I want to start talking a little bit about key players in our campaign, because it's really important to note that having a strong team of key players is going to be essential in any campaign. And so to start this conversation off, I want to talk about our executive team and who was a part of that. So our consultants at the Lou Edwards Group, we knew they had a successful track record working on measures related to cannabis revenue. We also had Mayor Darrell Steinberg, council members Mai Ving and Jay Chenier, who is actually now retired, who were our youth advocates and leaders as a part of our executive team. And we had lead organizations from the coalition like EBAYC, HIP Youth Forward, and other Sac Kids First partners who were involved in the mix, ensuring that the whole entire process of the campaign was also community led and involved. So during our campaign, we had a couple of key endorsers and neutral political players, which I just wanted to highlight because in other cities and governing bodies, I know that a couple of these are very influential as well. And so specifically in Sacramento, we have a very influential fire union, labor council, and police union. And you'll see here exactly the way that they related to our campaign. So our fire union actually endorsed and donated to our campaign. That was not the same for the previous campaign, Measure G, but we can say that for Measure L, we were able to turn that relationship into a positive one to actually have that union support us. We also got the support of the Sacramento Central Labor Council, and they endorsed our campaign. And the police union stayed neutral this time. Whereas last time during our Measure G campaign, they actually raised money against us. A couple of other things that we wanted to mention that were really important were pre-placement budget needs. So this is money that was needed ahead of the campaign, ahead of essentially initiating the strategy for the campaign, but that really built out what the campaign was going to look like. So for example, we needed to bring on consultants to support with the development of a poll and draft our ballot language. Another piece that is pre-placement is our polling and testing our messaging and ballot language to see if we actually had a viable campaign. All this legal assistance and going back and forth with attorneys to make sure that our language was correct and that we had a viable campaign, this entire process costs money. And later on in today's presentation, our consultant, Catherine Liu, will talk more about that. So I'm gonna pass it over to Catherine so that she can introduce herself and tell y'all a little bit more about our strategy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine. I'm so thrilled and honored to be here today to join our co-panelists in sharing some wisdom and lessons from our successful Yes on L campaign. Just a little bit about myself, and this is a part where you're supposed to gasp and say, oh my God, she looks remarkably well preserved. I have an over 30-year career in community organizing and politics. And my firm, the Lou Edwards Group, is currently celebrating our 26th year as a company. As Monica mentioned, we have extensive experience specifically in cannabis revenue measures. Thank you, everybody. But Another very strong part of our practice is we do believe that people power and financial power hand in hand make change. Towards this end, it's been our honor to enact over 42 billion with a 95% win rate in revenue measures across the state, including funding measures, other types of funding measures for children, libraries, schools, and general fund set-asides. Finally, I will note about our firm 26 years ago, and it so remains true today. We were one of the first, and still, I believe currently, the only woman AAPI, Native American, and Black firm operating at this level. So I was so very honored when the Youth Forward team first contacted me, I should say, a year before placement of a potential measure on the ballot. And that is important because we should touch on what does it mean to ensure placement of a viable measure? That means, in the world in which I travel, ensuring that we can lift our young people and our constituencies who are organizing around this with a successful measure. As the team's consultant, it was my responsibility to be able to look them in the face and say, working together, we have already placed a viable measure on the ballot. Now we just have to execute. And one of the first things I did for EBAYC Youth Forward was I took a peek at the previous measures, particularly the initiative, which only required a simple majority and got 45%. And I roared and I said, it is not your fault. Forgive this phrase. The fix was in over the construction of the ballot question that you were assigned by the city who had the power. So let's talk next about the importance of polling. Importance of investing in polling. So as I just mentioned, at all costs, the governing body, whether it's the council or a county board of supervisors, should place a viable measure on your coalition's behalf. This is the most single important tactical foundation to ensure our successful, empowered community campaign. And we use science to determine whether that's so. A professionally conducted poll draws a sample of likely voters, not all residents, but in this unique space, likely voters only in your chosen election cycle to determine overall viability. What does that mean? Number one, we first evaluate a conceptual 75-word ballot question. All of you being good voters, you'll recall that when you open your voter pamphlet, for each and every measure, there's usually a 75-word or less run-on sentence with a question mark at the end and a box, yes, no. Somebody like me has carefully tested through polling every word and phrase in that ballot question, together and separately. And we have taken each of the word phrases like jigsaw puzzle pieces and reconstructed them into a winning measure. And that is before one voter phone call is made, one campaign dollar is raised. We also test the messages that move voters towards your vision, and most importantly, assess whether your measure can withstand attack. Finally, it is imperative that the governing body, that is the city council or county board of supervisors, place a ballot question that aligns with your poll-tested version, because the change in language of as little as 3 words can swing percentage support 7 to 10 points. So in using the Measure G example, the initiative where that measure got 45% of the vote and not the simple majority, for all we know, because the electeds deviated from language by just 3 or 4 words, that could have cost the election right there. What our polling showed, first of all, we're very, we had retained FM3 Research, one of the top polling firms in California, and we might add also a polling firm that we knew represented powerhouse Sacramento players, giving our efforts important credibility coming out of the box. They developed a survey, but we didn't then just start interviews. Because we had City Council member Jay Chenier as a member of our core team, he took the draft polling language back to the city attorney and secured her approval of that ballot language in writing before a single interview was done. That was to foreclose any possibility of a few months later, change in words of just 3 words, eliminating that risk. Going on. We were buoyed to find that there was a very strong reaction to the conceptual ballot question. It polled easily at over 2/3 of the vote with cushion. We also tested a variety of possible service priorities. There were as many, as I remember, as 24 such priorities tested. Not all of them appear on this page. Some of them tested 40 percentiles below the top scoring message of helping children under 5 whose families are homeless, which scored at 83%. In other words, there are other services that scored at 42%. Not wanting to disempower the coalition and its vision. As a consultant, it was our responsibility to refrain from editing or imposing our opinions on the coalition, but simply pointing out that temporarily, through the course of the campaign, we would be zeroing down only on the top 2 or 3 messages that were the most effective. Going on to the next slide. And we also tested messages in favor of the measure themes. And you can see here that there is a commonality in that homelessness ended up testing in the top tier of the messages. It was very important to consider the context, the Sacramento context of that election, and also pay attention to other things that were on the ballot or recently on the ballot. And we knew that homelessness as a moral ethic and issue and a voter issue was heavily debated amongst Sacramento voters at that time. We did not see it as a downside, but as an opportunity to advance our vision, shrewdly using that as one of our many messages. Okay, getting to yes and a winning campaign. So just to recap, we had invested in our polling. We had reached coalition consensus. We had secured city attorney approval on the ballot question. Through the efforts of the council boosters supporting us, we had already done our head count to make sure that we had enough votes to place the ballot question that we wanted on the measure. So the first thing is the importance of the logo. One might think, oh, don't we just create a logo using the measure letter and make sure it's pretty? A key issue on that election ballot was Prop 1, whether California would codify the right to a woman's right to have control over her own body on issues such as abortion. The choice of pink in this instance was not an accident. We had to have pink in our logo to capture and maximize the opportunity of a lot of women going to the ballot. You'll also notice the cheerful colors and the motion that's in this logo. We felt on the consulting side, the heavy and joyful, but heavy responsibility of the fact that the coalition had already suffered 2 election disappointments. We were determined that this campaign would show the voters the empowering, joyful, and necessary side of their vision. And that speaks to color, that speaks to motion, that speaks to shrewdly knowing what's in the environment and taking advantage of it. Empowerment. Sadly, while this is not true of many consultants who take this task, the Lou Edwards Group walks into any campaign like this from the standpoint of how do we not only win, but run the foot race so it is empowering to the coalitions and the children that we serve. We made a number of decisions from jump. We would showcase the experience and the voices of our courageous young people and what they need in their own words. We would not only work swing undecided voters, but our base of people that had a natural tendency to support these measures. And we would empower through positivity. Now going on to the tactics. So to achieve all of these goals, we made an early decision that we would not send our 16-year-olds or our high school students or our brave young people to the homes of voters that our polling knew to be undecided. We wanted them to have not only a positive experience, but an experience that added value to the campaign. So we made an early decision that our down-home grassroots fundraising efforts or voter efforts would target the base. Those voters that had a natural inclination to support, but needed a reminder to make their way all the way down the ballot to find Measure L. And that we would use paid professional phoning and paid professional texting to work the harder nut of voters that needed persuasion. You need both halves, of course, to meet the whole, and we thought this was a good way to do this. Finally, a pragmatic. We had a healthy budget, but a limited one. It was our responsibility to create a strategy where every likely voter that we thought we had a chance of winning over was touched. This did mean a strategic decision to spend our dollar on likely voters and not on new voters who may or may not return a mail ballot or turn out on conventional election day. Okay, here's an example of our initial walk piece. I'll go through the next series of slides really quickly to show the visuals. You see the color and the images. Equity was a top scoring issue that we found in the poll that was showcased front and center. And then the yellow boxes show we were very shrewd and disciplined about zeroing in on those messages that had resonance. Going to the next set of slides, we were very proud, and it was our honor that children and youth stepped up on their own and wanted to be showcased. We showcased them with joy, including youth and children that were previously homeless. And for those voters who care about these things, some mainstream cred when the Sacramento Bee endorsed, you look instantly at this sheet and there's something for everyone on this mailing. Going to the next, more of the same. And now I'm going to talk about something. Present company accepted, of course, should there be any elected officials or those that come from outsider movement, but could be more fiscally conservative. We did execute what I called a shaming strategy. And when you see the faces, and these captions are a bit small to read, the faces and the outcomes that this measure achieved, I said straight up to the coalition, our goal is to say, shame on you, shame on those that do not come on board our growing coalition. Shame on the voters who do not look at these faces and feel compelled. And this met my test for being able to execute that shaming strategy. To go on, of course, everyone likes a winner. We spread the word. We have a winning measure. We have council placement of that measure. We have young people who this will wonderfully serve. We have a huge coalition, and they were like fleas jumping on a dog, or eager coalition partners joining, depending on one's point of view. Oh, and I should also say that it's not possible to show today, but we also had a paid social media program that featured digital ads that specifically elevated our youth voices. And they spoke spontaneously and with pride of their own stories and experiences. And those paid digital ads were only disseminated to likely voters. Thank you. I'm ready for the next. Thank you. All right, now we must speak seriously about something very important: how to withstand political attack. And we find this in general fund set aside and what we call revenue conversion measures, like this cannabis measure, due to perceptions and realities of limited budgets. Unfortunately, we have many sometimes worthy constituencies fighting over what they perceive as a limited pie. So while we did not show it on today's deck, we did test not only for the dimples, but for the warts. We tested the arguments that we felt could be used against in our poll to understand what the vulnerability was. We were happy to see that those attacks bounced off us. And that's why it's important to clarify, to understand if someone says these things, should we be concerned or should we not be concerned? Because these attacks come in many forms, trying to shut you down before you start. The ballot arguments, pro and con, the attack ads, mail, and more. So a couple of things happened. The opponents, as we hoped, were isolated. Only two, it happened to be two elected officials, signed the ballot argument against. They were outflanked by our coalition that was showcased in the ballot arguments pro and con. And we knew immediately when we looked at their ballot argument against that would not be effective. They also then went to a local publication, a local newspaper, and persuaded the editorial board once more to attack in citywide messaging, communications, and in this publication. It created understandable anxiety and fear amongst coalition partners. And the question was, oh my God, should we respond? Do we respond? They've said these things. They're suggesting that people of color can't spend money wisely. They're saying we will waste the money. They're using race, clearly but subliminally. And I counseled the coalition, and everyone coalesced around a consensus that the poll showed that these attacks would not work. And by responding tit for tat, we would only be playing in their messaging box. We had to have a strategy of like an avalanche, smothering the attacks through an avalanche of our own positive messaging. And you know what we did? The coalition decided to spend $5,000, a bitter pill to swallow, to take out an ad in that publication that was attacking us. Not to say, well, you're wrong on this point and we're right, and you're wrong and we're right, but to use that previous slide where we showed all the coalition partners and we led with the firefighters and the mayor who had previously opposed other measures, and the Sacramento Bee to say, here we are, deal with it. We did not sink to that level. Thank you to So we stuck to our messaging platform at all costs. We did not respond to their BS. We did not overreact. We were calm as cucumbers. So in closing, Monica and others will speak more about it. This is just an example of what we spent money on. The largest ticket items were all on voter contact. And in most cases, I mean, it'll cost 50, 75 to 100 grand, depending on the size of your jurisdiction and the politics of it, on your placement strategy. We discovered that funders wanted to know about a variety of things, which Monica will cover next.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to leave this slide up. So if folks are interested in just looking at pretty much our expenditures and what we spent our money on. But I also wanted to say that it's very true that, you know, the opposition happened and there were a lot of mixed emotions and strong feelings about wanting to respond. And I just appreciate Catherine and as well as other ledge staff that really kind of walked us through that process, because, you know, especially if you're working with the community coalition of folks who are passionate about the work that they do and working on the ground, it's very frustrating to see people attack you and what you do for a living, and how you put yourself out there to serve community and you get attacked. And it was very important for us to come together as a group. And like Nia said in the chat, we were not going to stoop down to their level. And so I think that that was very strategic on our behalf, albeit it was difficult to get to that point because we were very much frustrated. But, you know, we came out on top, and there's more to say about, you know, having that resistance to respond and being very strategic. So moving on, I did just want to highlight our total expenditures for this campaign so that folks know exactly the amount of dollars we were working with and what we actually spent. An important thing to remember is that grassroots fundraising is always welcome, especially if you're building coalition, relationships, partners with other organizations. You always want to have events that are fun and community relationship building. And there's also a need for high-level donors. So the reality we knew was that our grassroots fundraising was only going to get us a certain amount of dollars for the actual campaign, and we still needed to be out there engaging higher level donors. Oftentimes, those high-level donors need to be encouraged via a highly likely winning campaign, as well as morale. So of course, when we had meetings with these donors, we talked to them about why this campaign was necessary now. We definitely used COVID and everything that happened during that time, specifically how it impacted our young people, in order to leverage those stories and have young people also talk about their experiences and what their needs were, so that those higher level donors could essentially be convinced to donate money to our campaign. So below, I just included in different categories, different donors of our campaign. This is not everyone. We did have individual donors as well, but these are some donors that I thought would be important to include. And again, I know and understand that all of this is public information. And so if you were really curious to know who all of our donors were, there is a list, and we can also gladly share that out. But we had organizations and unions that donated to us. We had money come in from philanthropic sources, as well as the health industry. And really every single dollar counts, because if you've ever worked on a campaign before, and this is actually my first time doing it at this level, it's actually really expensive. Like all of those mail pieces, that the ads that are now really important as a part of a campaign, because our world is very digital. We needed to make sure that we had money for that. So if anyone has any questions about that specifically, feel free to include that in the question and A. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Dow so he can talk a little bit about nonprofits in campaign work.
All right. Hopefully y'all could hear me. But yeah, thanks Catherine and Monica for that, that transition and smooth handoff. But to kind of kick us off, I just wanted to do a quick reintroduction of myself as well too. But so my name is Dow Vang. I go by he, him, his, and I work as the Sacramento field organizer for also a 501c3 nonprofit organization called HIP, or Hmong Innovating Politics, right? And some of the stuff that I do is that we do civic engagement work such as door-to-door knocking and also phone banking to kind of engage voters in the southeast Fresno and also South Sacramento regions, serving as a civic engagement resource for Hmong and our Southeast Asian American community as well, right? So one is that this means that we're speaking with voters that are in language who are going to be impacted by these local policies the most, right? And two is like, they often do not get contacted by larger campaigns or are often ignored because they don't like vote consistently, right? So in a sense, they're low propensity. That's what I guess the term is, right? So, we know that our communities care about these issues and wants to be engaged, but there are a lot of like systemic barriers that prevent them from participating, right? So kind of like our job is to make sure that, they exercise their right to vote, right? And I guess two things to kind of know is that as a 501c3 organization, you can be politically involved in ballot measures, right? However, you cannot be involved in political campaign on behalf or also in opposition to any candidate that's running for a public office, right? And I think this works the same way as political donations as well, right? So, yeah, to kind of transition just to the next point, I'm just going to talk a little bit about coalition building as the core foundation of like why we were so successful in our campaign. And I think the infrastructure that was already built by Monica and our previous like leaders that were a part of the coalition were already there, right? However, I think HIP as HIP, me, and one of the staffers that's in the audience too. So I'm going to give her a shout out. Maki, I know you're in the audience, but I think we were both onboarded to help Monica kind of amplify the structure a little bit more, just because like knowing seeing the support that Monica needed, right? So I think this made it a lot easier when it came time to mobilize folks, right? Each organization came with their own base of people that they had already been cultivating relationship with, and I think this just made it easier to build people power, kind of like what Catherine had mentioned earlier, right? Especially when it came to door knocking and also phone banking, which we needed all hands on deck to sort of win this campaign, right? And I think when you think about sustainability too, campaign work specifically can definitely feel lonely at times, right? However, I think just having that coalition to work with towards like one overarching goal, right, and flipping the measure out to a W, right, it made it way more sustainable, right? So where like we could divide and conquer on like the stuff that we needed to do to turn this measure into a win, right? And I think because of these relationships, these transformative relationships that were formed, right, there was this trust, and this really allowed the campaign to be driven by youth, by young people, and which in my observation is kind of rare, right? And this really strengthened like our campaign as well. Young people, they don't really have a voice because they can't vote, right? Yeah, but they are going to be the most impacted by this local measure. So it's important that they get a lead and also take place in the systems change work that can transform their lives, and not just including them, right? But also including like their cousins, their nieces and nephew, right? So I think in terms of people power, this also helped turn out our youth to come out and campaign with us as well, right? Because, they already had formed that relationship with their youth, and that just made it like transition smoothly, right? So another key point is that, our ground game was strong, right? And I think having a really strong ground game matters. I really can't emphasize this enough. And I think this is where HIP kind of led Measure L's grassroots ground campaign with the coalition, right? And it was just really important for HIP to kind of center community and also coalition partners, because they are going to be the most impacted by this policy, right? So only our organization, young people, have the personal narrative and lived experiences to not just refute the opposition, but more importantly, give people a reason to vote yes, right? And as Catherine mentioned earlier, having youth come out to door knock or to Cannabis and phone bank, et cetera, was really critical in changing the narratives of minds of voters at the door, right? Even the folks that had supported us in the past, right? And there's something really powerful to be said when a youth knock on your door and share their story, right? And I remember we had hosted a canvassing day with a partner organization, and one of the parents had brought their child or their youth out to also canvass with us, and the parent had reflected about how different of an experience it was bringing her child along versus just canvassing by herself the week prior, right? And conversations were less difficult at the door. Community members were more open to hearing what they had to say when the child was also canvassing with the parent as well too. And another key thing is that the youth, they're so enthusiastic and they're so hyped up. I'm thinking about a phone banking experience, a phone banking day we had, and we had brought youth to also come canvass, and it was it was like raining that evening too. But then them being there made it super hyped up, and it was just filled with energy, right? And so I think even though we failed to pass versions of this measure twice, we didn't let that stop us, and used it as a kind of learning opportunity on how to strengthen our ground game, right? So I think just using the data that we had from previous measure helped us pinpoint which areas we needed to canvass throughout Sacramento, right? And we used this this voting tool, or this political data app called PEI, that provided voter data through means of canvassing and phone banking to really help us pinpoint these people that needed to be moved, right? So, and then just lastly, we also trained folks to navigate difficult conversations they experience at the doors as well too, and on the phone as well. So just to kind of wrap up, I think ways that nonprofit organizations could get involved is that base building, especially during the off cycle. So this year would be considered an off cycle, since 2024 is going to be a big election year, right? So I think as a way to kind of get involved is that you can start building that base, so that when it comes time to kind of start forming coalition, you could cultivate these transformative relationships that I kind of touched upon, right? So that you as organizers don't burn out. And then upbringing matters, right? So aside from points that I mentioned earlier, it's important to cultivate a culture of being civically engaged for young people, and also give them opportunities for them to share their story, right? So you could organize folks to make public comments. You can really talk about the way that you grew up, and also the way that they grew up in their respective communities, right? And you could also, you can bring youth and young adults to talk about their present day and what's going on with their everyday lives as well. So I'll just stop it there, and then I'll transition back to Monica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dao. And I'm putting our contact information here if anyone would like to follow up with us individually to talk more about the campaign and our efforts. But really quickly, I know we want to have minutes left over for Q&A, but I just want to say this work did not happen singularly with just Youth Forward or any one entity that was involved. It really happened as a group and as a coalition. And I can't thank EBAYC and HIP enough for their leadership in being involved in the campaign to this extent. I mean, just to highlight what Dao mentioned, Dao and Maki, who is in the audience today, aside from their full-time work with HIP, also were brought onto the campaign team. And so that just goes to show the passion and the dedication behind making this happen. I'm not, suggesting that folks, take on 2 jobs and multiple jobs, but sometimes, in our work, it's necessary to do extra work in order to make these things happen. And so Thank you to the entire team, as well as within Sac Kids First, we have a planning committee, which also really acted as an organizing body for the campaign ground game and the strategy. And so I can't thank those leaders enough. We have concluded our presentation for today. And so I'm going to ask Sarah Michael to come on the screen so that we can get started with our Q&A portion for the last 6 or so minutes of our time today.
Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. We only have a few questions right now, so if you have any, please start putting them in the Q&A box. But the first one I'll start out with is, are there plans to share this story more widely and nationally? If I can answer, I think yes. We will share this out as much as we can. And if people are interested in it, on a national level, then, we're more than happy to interview about it or, put out maybe a press release or something. So I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to comment on that, of us sharing our story. I don't see anyone. So then the second question is about fundraising and whether it ran perpendicularly with the political campaign, and how difficult is that when organizing such a large campaign? So I'm thinking, like, is it difficult to fundraise and run that political campaign?
I'm going to ask Catherine to come off mute. I'll try to answer this question. My answer is, if folks are wondering if we raised a large amount of money ahead of the campaign, I would say no. We definitely raised money as the campaign was already going along. And, we even raised money even right until like election day, essentially, to pay off a lot of the money that we had already previously spent on things like the mailers and the lawn signs, et cetera. But Catherine, I don't know if you wanted to chime in, because I know,
Thank you. Again, the recipes for successful campaigns like these is a marriage and synergy between our moral imperative and the tactics. So on the tactical side, do remember, I know that everyone understands this, but I want to rip the Band-Aid off. We are in a mail ballot situation. So on the consulting side, we no longer call these November campaigns. We call them October campaigns. There is no March primary. It's a February primary, because we actually now prepare, and we prepared the coalition for this, for 4 October elections every single weekend, and then traditional mail ballot drop off, or traditional election day. This does mean that the bulk of your advocacy dollars needs to be raised in the November election, not by the November election, but by the first weekend in October. The coalition did an outstanding and very adept job of calibrating. So immediately after filing, we created a schedule and noted that being dark any of those weeks would not be an option. And so even though we didn't raise all the money by October 1st, we knew what was coming. And at the very end, there was a very important, I think, as I recall, $25,000 ask from a major donor, a foundation partner. And we were able to make the case. We were able to show everything that we had done to that point, and basically make the case that the money was needed immediately to get that last mailing out. And they did come through. But, the takeaway that we want people to have is this takes organization. It takes clearly understanding and accepting that's not a single election day. but a 5 election day scenario. And if we can't raise all the money the month before, we need a game plan to meet cash flow each and every week.
I hope that answered your question, Katarina. I think a good follow-up question that maybe Catherine can address is how have strategies changed now that mail-in voting has increased? Like there used to be a bigger push as election day comes up, but now a lot of people have already voted weeks before then.
Yes, good question. I'll elaborate on my previous answer. So the way we do these campaigns is we do plan for 5 election days, and we actually track a bell-shaped curve that happens each and every weekend and a dump of late ballots. Certain voter apps actually allow us to track who votes early. Like there's people like my father, the sample ballot handbook comes, he starts reading it, and then his ballot comes and he literally runs from the mailbox, rips the envelope open, goes to the kitchen table and starts marking it. And then there's people like me in my hometown of Oakland. I say, oh, well, I'll be eliminated from the voter roll if I vote too early. I want to see everyone's mail. So I deliberately wait until the end. Sometimes I'm not even that organized, so I turn it in. But actually, a good strategy allows you to see who falls into what habit. And so if funds are running dry or short or not as projected, we'll calibrate. The gold standard is to hit all the likely voters multiple times and eliminate those that have already voted as the month progresses. In the tight cash flow situation, we can also target those that vote earlier only and have fewer touches. But that's a very important part of the execution of the campaign plan. And finally, I will say a lot of people ask, oh, is this wasteful, environmentally bad paper mail still necessary to do? Everyone recycles. Yes, but there are groups of people, most specifically 65 and up, that still look at the mail. And then that needs to be one of many, not the most important, but one of many components of a successful toolkit, which needs to also include field operations that touch paid digital and shooting video that is texted to cell phones and emailed to voters, and print advertising. The whole ball of wax is necessary.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'll just move on to the next question that I think people want to hear is about what are our next steps? And now that the ballot measure has passed, how do we influence the distribution and use of funds?
I'd be happy to chime in here. So I just wanted to do a quick time check-in, and Sarah shared in the chat. So we are a little past 11, but we have some questions we want to answer for y'all. So please stick around if you can. If not, we will, of course, share the recording at a later date. So to answer this question about what are we going to do now and what are our next steps, we are now in the early stages of the implementation phase of the Sacramento Children's Fund. And of course, because this Children's Fund is housed within the City of Sacramento, there is a lot of logistics and internal systems that need to essentially kick in and start moving in order for the process to really begin. So what we had written into the measure itself was that there was going to be at least a year of planning due to the fact that no money could be spent on services until there was a 5-year strategic plan developed by an oversight commission that needed to be appointed by the city council as well as the mayor. So 1 commissioner appointed per elected official. And so because of that, that process essentially needs to start this year so that money could be spent in July of 2024 and granted out to services both in the community as well as services in the city itself. So we are definitely in the early stages of implementation, and you can email me if you would like to get more directly involved. I'm happy to have a conversation with folks that are interested in getting involved in Sacramento's implementation. I'll put this back up so that folks know where to contact. But Sarah, did you want to keep going, keep us moving?
Yeah, I was just answering the chat or answering the question on in the box. But our next one, I feel like we went over how do we influence the distribution of use of funds. And I feel like, Monica, you were saying that first we have to establish the 5-year plan strategy, which the oversight committee will do. And also the city can't spend money on services until that has happened. But I believe, like, how will we influence the distribution of use of funds? We will want to get as many of our coalition partners and people that we know are allies to sit on that committee that the city will house. And you know, the individuals will have experience in the variety of areas that we are looking for, you know, so homeless youth, foster youth, youth that have experienced violence, and so, and then that will be us, like, continually meeting with all of our coalition partners to talk about, you know, how do we, you know, make sure that these dollars are going to the agencies and organizations that are doing the work to support our young people. So I think that, so short, deeper. I hope that answered your question, Amy. If you have more or want more in detail, please reach out to Monica or anyone else on this contact form. And then I think another question we have is, what would you recommend be a realistic timeline to launch a ballot campaign? Which I feel like is very nuanced.
So when I came on camera, I mentioned that Youth Forward and EBAYC contacted us a year before placement. We are currently representing measures for November 2024, where we got started last December. So we are very much proponents of starting early because for 2 reasons. First of all, for coalition measures, it is important to build in that relaxed time for consensus amongst you all on approach and vision and all of that. But for a strategist like me, the early identification of potential, yes, I will say it, opponents, critics, and people who will attack is critical, because we need to develop an inoculation strategy and get ahead of them and try to get them into our camp. And that does take time. So I would say for anyone looking at a November measure, you have enough time, but not extra time. We are starting earlier for 2024 because it's a presidential and there will be a lot of things on the ballot. So for those of you who are looking to go the initiative route or looking for direct county or city council, county board of supervisors or city council placement, do remember that unlike 2022, which was a gubernatorial year, in 2024, there will be more competitors for ballot measure space. And unless you go the initiative route for direct placement by an elected body, that means that there's going to be competition for ballot attention. So I've represented a number of clients where people are like, Well, public safety is far more important than you. Wait your turn, wait 2 years. So best to hear that feedback earlier rather than later to develop a strategy of how to steamroll over that, as an example.
Thank you. Okay, so I have one more question. Do you think that the success of your campaign can be replicated with introducing legal changes to the state of synthetic THC market, which is non-Delta 9 THC?
I can answer that one. Yeah, Youth Forward, we are working to address the emergence of these hemp products in the cannabis industry. And we're actually working on state legislation right now to address those concerns. And we're also tracking sort of the need to tax those products. It's kind of what we're seeing is the cannabis industry is kind of doing an end run on its current tax situation by developing these hemp products. So I'm happy to chat more about that if you'd like to connect, and I'll put my email in the chat box.
Thanks so much, Jim. So that is, it looks like that's the conclusion of our Q&A portion. And I just want to thank everyone who was able to stick around to hear the panelists and myself answer a couple of the questions. Again, I'm leaving our contact information up, and Jim is also going to add his to the chat so folks can see it, so that y'all can follow up with us. And I'm so glad that we got the opportunity to share our story with you all. Please keep in contact. We know that the political process is slow, and that oftentimes, and I just want to uplift what Albert said in the chat. I know that this process is slow and it doesn't work at the timeline that we need it to. And so this is one part of what can be a solution for the issues that young people are going through. It's not the and catch all be all. We know that there are other ways to advocate for funding for youth programs. And so we can have a larger conversation about that as well. But yeah, the reality is that the political process is slow and that it takes time and intention. And I'm just really thankful for all of the volunteers, even those who showed up one time, right? Because it takes a full effort for us to get to this point. And like we said, it was our third time and we didn't give up. So I just want to thank all the folks that are here today. Thank you all for joining. This webinar has concluded, and I hope that we continue to remain in touch with you all so that we can get more cities, counties, and local governments to invest more in our kids. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.